Hi gang, this is geometry and we're talking about section 1.3 today. These are some other properties that we're going to be using in this course. And properties are really just rules or laws that are true about quantities or numbers. And the first one we're going to talk about in this section are the properties of equality. All right, and equality, basically an equation is like a balance scale. If two things are equal, then they're balancing on this balance scale, all right? If I add something to one side, it's not balanced anymore unless I add exactly the same amount to the other side. And all equations have this sort of property that what you do to one side of the equal sign, you have to do to the other side of the equal sign to keep it equal. So these are properties of equality: addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. So whenever I add something to one side, I have to add the same thing to the other. Whenever I subtract something from one side of an equal sign, I have to subtract the same thing from the other. And so it goes, all right? Now the second property is substitution. This law says that if two things are equal and I have one thing in an equation, I can substitute in the other thing, all right? Like if x equals 4 in an equation, I can put 4 in for x in that equation, and it's the same thing. That's legal to do. That's substitution. Now, reflexive may seem a little bit goofy, but all it says is that a quantity is equal to itself. And you want to say, well, duh. And right. But that will show up sometime. There will be times when it's important to say that a segment length equals itself, and we'll get to that later, but that is the reflexive property. Now the symmetric property says that if one quantity equals a second quantity, then it has to be true that the second quantity equals the first quantity. And again, that's one of those duh ones, but it will come into play a bit later on. Finally, the transitive property, and this will come up quite a bit. This says if a first quantity equals a second quantity, and if that second quantity equals a third quantity, then what do you suppose has to be true? The first quantity has to equal the third quantity. In other words, if A equals B, and if B equals C, then it has to be true that A equals C. All right? And that is the transitive property. Now let's go to a few examples. Hi, gang. Again, this is Geometry Section 1.3, and we're talking about properties, and now we want to try and identify some of the properties. And I'm going to work these examples on your worksheet, number 7, 8, 9, and 15. So we'll start with number 7, and what they say is identify the property. If negative 4 equals 4q minus 4, then 4q minus 4 equals negative 4. And I'm thinking to myself, between these two equations, what did they do? They just took the stuff on either side of the equal sign and flipped it around. In other words, they said if one thing equals another thing, then it has to be true that the second thing has to equal the first thing. And which property is that? Well, that's the symmetric property. So that's what I'm going to write as my answer. Symmetric. 2 N's. Symmetric property. We always circle our answers. And now number 8. This says if 2h minus 3 equals negative 3, then 8h minus 12 equals minus 12. The question is, from the first equation to the second equation, what did they do? You know, how do these compare? Well, that's times 4. 2 times 4 is 8. Negative 3 times 4 is negative 12. Negative 3 times 4 is negative 12. What did they do to both sides of the equal sign from this equation to get to that equation? Well, they multiplied both sides of the equal sign times 4. And what property says you can multiply the same thing times both sides of the equal sign? Well, that is the multiplication property of equality. So that's what I'm going to put. Multiplication, I'm going to abbreviate here. property of equality. There's my answer, multiplication property of equality. Now down to number 9, and this is kind of a tricky one. It says if x plus 5 equals 5, then 5 equals negative x plus 5. And then the question is what they do from there to there. Well, you might want to say to yourself, well, all they did was take this side of the equal sign and that side and flip them around, but that negative sign says, nuh-uh, there was no negative on the x up here, so that can't be it. It can't be symmetric property. What is it? Well, if you look at what they did, from this side, left side of the equation on top to the bottom, they got rid of the x. What would I have to do to both sides to get rid of this x? Well, I'd have to subtract x, right? And suddenly this minus x shows up over here. So what they did was they subtracted the x, the amount x, from both sides of the equal sign. And what property says you can subtract the same amount from both sides of the equal sign? That's the subtraction property of equality. So that's the answer here. Subtraction property of equality. I'm going to abbreviate again. All right. Hope I don't run out of room on the bottom here. But this says, this is number 15. This says if the measure of angle WGD equals the measure of angle BWW, and why they use two W's, I don't know. It must be a typo. But we can still do the problem. Then the measure of angle BWW has to equal the measure of angle WGD. Well, what did they do from this equation to that equation? They just took the two sides and flipped them around. So all they said was, if one thing equals a second thing, then the second thing has to equal the first thing. And what property is that? Again, that's the symmetric property of equality. We kind of already used that one. I'm just going to put symmetric. I'm going to put it up here so you can see it. Symmetric. Circle my answer. All right. Other properties.